We survived 10 years of bankruptcy and hospital nights. Yet, he chose our anniversary to serve me divorce papers in a crowded restaurant. He thought I was sleeping with a billionaire, but he did not know that man was selling me the legacy his family lost. When I placed my gift on the table, he did not just feel regret, he went completely numb, paralyzed by the weight of the mistake that cost him everything. My name is Elena Vance. At 34 years old, I had spent the last decade climbing from a junior researcher to the project director at Atheris Biolabs. I was accustomed to managing high-stakes negotiations and volatile clinical data, but sitting alone at a corner table in the Obsidian, I felt a tremor in my hands that had nothing to do with work. The Chicago skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling glass, indifferent to the knot tightening in my stomach. I checked my reflection in the darkened window. I looked composed, but beneath the silk blouse, my shoulders ached with a fatigue that went bone deep. For 6 months, I had been living a double life. There were erratic flights to New York and Boston, hushed phone calls taken in the laundry room at 2 a.m, and weeks where I barely saw my own bed. I had told Mark it was a classified project, a massive push for a new biosynthetic graft that demanded total secrecy. That was only half the truth. The exhaustion was real, but the secrecy was not for the company. It was for him. Every lie I had told, every late night I had claimed to be at the lab, was a necessary brick in the foundation of the surprise I had built for tonight. Mark was a brilliant architect, a man who could see the soul of a building before the foundation was poured. But he was haunted. His family's bankruptcy 5 years ago had stripped them of everything, including Holloway Manor, the estate that had borne his surname for 3 generations. Losing that house broke something in him. He carried the shame like a physical weight, convinced that without his inheritance, he was less of a man. He had stopped drawing for himself and started obsessing over bank accounts that never seemed full enough. My hand drifted to my purse on the empty chair beside me. My fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface of a square velvet box hidden inside. I had liquidated my personal stock options, drained my savings, and bet my entire year-end performance bonus on what was inside that box. It was not jewelry. It was redemption. It was the deed to Holloway Manor, bought back from the bank in silence. I smiled faintly, imagining the look on his face when he realized he was going home. Then he arrived. Mark walked into the restaurant 20 minutes late. He did not apologize. He did not have flowers. He was wearing his charcoal suit, the one he saved for weddings and funerals, and he looked devastatingly handsome, yet entirely foreign. His eyes, usually warm and crinkling at the corners when he saw me, were flat and hard. He sat down without kissing me, pulling his napkin into his lap with sharp, jerky movements. I tried to reach across the widening chasm between us. I asked him about the renovation project downtown, hoping to spark that old light in his eyes. He did not look up from the menu. He cut me off with a dry laugh that lacked any humor. He asked how my big boss was doing, his tone dripping with an acidity that made me flinch. He emphasized the word boss with a sneer that suggested he meant something else entirely. I stared at him, really looked at him, and realized the man sitting across from me was not the husband who had held my hand through my appendectomy or danced with me in our tiny kitchen during the lean years. This was a stranger consumed by suspicion and an inferiority complex that had turned malignant. He did not see a wife who loved him. He saw a competitor he was losing to. He checked his watch again. It was the 3rd time in 10 minutes. He was not looking at the time because he was bored. He was waiting for something. His leg bounced under the table, vibrating the silverware. The air between us was so taut it felt like a violin string pulled to the breaking point, ready to snap and draw blood. I gripped my purse tighter, the velvet box suddenly feeling heavy, like a stone I was about to drown with. At exactly 8 o'clock, the atmosphere at our table shifted from tense to theatrical. A man in an ill-fitting beige suit approached us, moving with a purposeful stride that distinguished him from the fluid grace of the waitstaff. I assumed he was a manager coming to apologize for the delay in our service. But he did not stop at the side of the table. He walked directly to my right. Mark gave him a sharp nod, a signal so rehearsed it made my stomach turn. The stranger did not speak. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick, yellow manila envelope, and dropped it squarely onto my empty dinner plate. It landed with a heavy, final thud, replacing the dessert I had been waiting for. I stared at the envelope, my mind refusing to process the bold black letters stamped across the front. Before I could look up, Mark pushed his chair back, the legs screeching against the polished floor. He stood up, his chest heaving with a performative rage that projected his voice well beyond our intimate corner. He announced that he was filing for divorce effective immediately. His voice was not shaking with sorrow. It was booming with the clarity of a prosecutor making a closing argument. I glanced around frantically and saw heads turning at the surrounding tables. 3 men at a booth near the entrance were watching us with rapt attention, and with a sick jolt, I recognized them. They were junior partners from Mark's architectural firm. He had brought an audience. Mark pointed a shaking finger at me and declared that he knew everything about Dr. Sterling. He spat the name out like a curse. He accused me of sleeping with our 70-year-old lead investor to secure my funding. He claimed my exhaustion was not from work, but from carrying on a sordid affair with a man old enough to be my father. The accusation was so absurd, so detached from reality, that my voice died in my throat. I tried to speak, to explain that Sterling was a mentor, a happily married man who only cared about the integrity of our clinical trials. But Mark cut me off with a wave of his hand. He threw a stack of printed photographs onto the table, scattering them over the unopened divorce papers. They were grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. One showed me entering the Four Seasons Hotel with Sterling at midnight. Another showed us sitting close together in a lobby, reviewing documents. To an outsider, it looked intimate. Mark did not know, or refused to care, that we were finalizing the acquisition of the land trust that held his family's old estate. He then read aloud a text message I had sent Sterling 2 days ago about finalizing the arrangement and making the payment. Mark twisted my words about a real estate transaction into a confession of paid intimacy. The humiliation washed over me like ice water. This was not a heartbreak, it was a calculated strike. Mark did not just want to leave me, he wanted to destroy my reputation. He was staging this public execution to paint me as the adulterous villain, leveraging the moral high ground to secure a better settlement in court. He wanted the narrative, and he wanted the money he thought I was hoarding. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the triumph in his eyes. He thought he had cornered me. He expected me to cry, to beg him to lower his voice, to plead my innocence in front of his colleagues. Instead, a strange, cold calm settled over me. It was the same clinical detachment I felt when a lab experiment failed catastrophically. I did not shed a tear. I did not scream. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my skirt. I looked Mark dead in the eye, my expression entirely void of the emotion he was desperate to provoke. I reached down and picked up my purse, feeling the heavy weight of the velvet box inside the deed to the manor he was currently mourning. I left the yellow envelope on the plate. I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant, the sound of Mark's confused silence following me all the way to the door. I drove until the city lights thinned out into the dull orange glow of the industrial district. I pulled into the cracked parking lot of a roadside motel that smelled of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. I had attempted to go home first, purely out of habit, but as I pulled into our driveway, my phone alerted me that my access to the smart lock had been revoked. Mark had not just served me papers, he had erased my digital fingerprint from our life before I even left the restaurant. He wanted me on the street, so I chose a place where he would never think to look for me. Inside the cramped room, the silence was heavy. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and placed the velvet box on the scarred nightstand. Under the harsh fluorescent light, the red fabric looked almost black. I opened it slowly. Inside lay a heavy brass key, tarnished by time, and the folded deed to Holloway Manor. I ran my thumb over the legal description of the property. I had spent months negotiating with banks and tracking down the holding company that seized the estate 5 years ago. I had intended to hand this to Mark tonight and watch the burden of his family's failure lift from his shoulders. Now, it sat there like a tombstone for a marriage that had died long before tonight. I did not weep. The shock had cauterized my emotions, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer. It was late, but she answered on the second ring. I did not ask for mediation. I did not ask for counseling references. I told her to prepare for a scorched earth defense. I wanted a full forensic accounting of our assets, and I wanted every interaction with Mark to go through her office. I was done protecting him. While I waited for her to send over the engagement documents, I made the mistake of opening the family cloud account on my tablet, which was still synced to Mark's messages. I watched in real time as a group chat named Vance Family popped up with notification after notification. Mark was spinning his tale. He told his mother and sisters that he had caught me. He called me a gold digger who had used his connections to climb the ladder and then discarded him for a wealthy sugar daddy. His mother responded with vitriol, calling me trash and saying she always knew I was not good enough for their bloodline. His sisters chimed in, celebrating his freedom, reading their words. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Mark was not just jealous, he was pathologically insecure. He could not accept that his wife had succeeded where he had failed. In his twisted logic, it was easier to believe I was sleeping my way to the top than to admit I was simply better at business than he was. If I was a cheater, he was the victim. If I was successful, he was the failure. He needed me to be the villain to save his own fragile ego. A darker resolve hardened in my chest. I could have sent him a photo of the deed right then. I could have explained everything and watched him crumble in shame within the hour, but that was too easy. He wanted a public spectacle. He wanted a war. I decided I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would let him sit in his victory. I would let him tell everyone he knew that he had won. I would let him bloat himself on his own hubris for a few weeks until he felt untouchable. I closed the tablet and called Dr. Sterling. He answered immediately, his voice gruff with sleep but sharp with concern. When I told him what happened, he was apoplectic. He offered to fly to Chicago the next morning to confront Mark himself, but I stopped him. I told him I needed something else. I needed his testimony, his travel logs, and the security footage from our late-night negotiation sessions. He agreed without hesitation. I hung up the phone and looked at the brass key one last time before snapping the velvet box shut. I had a plan now. I would not just prove my innocence. I was going to show Mark the exact cost of his betrayal. I would wait for the legal discovery phase, and then I would reveal the truth when he had no room left to maneuver. He wanted to take everything from me, so I would show him that he was the one who had thrown away the only treasure he had left. The adrenaline from the restaurant scene buzzed under my skin like a cheap drug as I walked into our silent house. I had done it. I had finally taken a sledgehammer to the pedestal everyone had placed her on, shattering the image of the perfect, successful Elena. I poured myself a stiff glass of scotch, expecting to feel a rush of liberation, but as the liquid burned down my throat, the silence of the empty rooms pressed against my ears. There was a hollow ache in my chest, a strange echo where my wife used to be, but I drowned it out. I told myself this was not loss. This was victory. My phone vibrated against the granite island, pulling me out of the quiet. It was my mother. She had been waiting for this news for years, always claiming Elena was too ambitious for her own good. She told me I was a hero for finally reclaiming my dignity and escaping that cold, calculating woman. Then came the texts from my friends, the guys at the firm who had always looked at Elena's paycheck with a mixture of envy and resentment. They hailed me as a legend, a man who had dodged a bullet. Their validation was intoxicating. It confirmed what I desperately needed to believe I was the victim here, and I had finally taken control, fueled by their praise. I marched into her home office. It still smelled like her vanilla perfume and stale coffee. I started ripping through her desk drawers, looking for the smoking gun that would cement my case in court. I needed concrete proof to destroy her, buried under a stack of scientific journals. I found a small notepad. In her jagged, hurried handwriting, she had written 2 words, "Final payment." Below it was a date, just 2 days prior. A surge of dark triumph rushed through me. This was it. She was funneling our money to Sterling. She was paying for her lover's affection, or, worse, hiding marital assets before the split. I took a picture of the note, my hands shaking with the thrill of the hunt. I needed that money to be real. The truth I refused to say out loud was that my own finances were a disaster. The firm had cut my bonuses 2 years in a row, and I had made a series of high-risk investments trying to match Elena's earning power, all of which had tanked. I was bleeding cash. This divorce was not just about pride anymore, it was a financial rescue mission. I needed half of her shares in Aetheris Biolabs. I convinced myself I earned it. Had I not supported her when she was just a graduate student, had I not sacrificed my weekends so she could study, I was entitled to a return on that investment. I called my lawyer, a man known for his ruthlessness. When I told him about the note and the shares, he suggested we go further. He told me we should claim ownership of her intellectual property. He argued that since she developed her key patents during our marriage, I had a claim to the future royalties. It sounded predatory, even to me, but I pushed the hesitation away. She had betrayed me first. She had humiliated me with a man old enough to be her father. She deserved to lose everything she had built. That night, however, the confidence wavered. I slept fitfully, haunted by a vivid nightmare. I dreamt of the winter I lost my job 3 years ago, the lowest point of my life. In the dream, Elena was there, sitting on the floor beside me, holding my hand and telling me I was brilliant, that we would get through it together. I woke up sweating, a pang of guilt twisting my gut so hard I nearly threw up. For a second, I missed her so much I could not breathe. But then I looked at the empty side of the bed and remembered the photos of her entering the hotel with Sterling. The guilt hardened back into a cold, protective anger. She had played me for a fool. 3 days later, I received a formal notification from her office. She was not fighting the summons. She agreed to meet at her lawyer's office in 3 weeks to sign the papers and, as the message phrased it, exchange final anniversary gifts. I laughed out loud in the empty kitchen. Gifts. She was clearly trying to soften me up. She was terrified. She knew I had her cornered with the evidence, and she was coming to surrender. I imagined her sliding a check across the table, begging for silence. I would take the check, but I would not give her the silence. She thought she could buy me off, but she was about to learn that I was coming for everything. For the next 3 weeks, I treated the dissolution of my marriage like a hostile corporate takeover. I did not sleep, and I certainly did not cry. Instead, I methodically assembled a dossier that was thick enough to be a weapon in its own right. My home office became a war room where I organized travel logs, credit card statements, and time-stamped security feeds into a narrative of indisputable truth. I approached this with the same cold efficiency I used to manage clinical trials, removing every variable that could possibly allow Mark to spin a different story. My first stop was the bank. I sat across from the branch manager, a woman who had known us since we opened our first joint savings account with $100. I requested a complete forensic audit of the withdrawals Mark had flagged as suspicious. The paper trail was clear. The large sums of money that Mark believed were funding a secret life with a lover had all been wired to a singular escrow account held by a blind trust. I had the manager print out the official wire transfer confirmations, highlighting the beneficiary name. It was not Dr. Sterling. It was the Holloway Estate Holding Company. Every single cent of the missing $500,000 was accounted for, down to the penny. Next, I met with Dr. Sterling. He was still fuming over the accusation, but he had delivered exactly what I asked for. He handed me a hard drive containing the security footage from the hotel conference rooms we had rented for our negotiations. I watched the clips to ensure they were perfect. There was no candlelight, no wine, and certainly no intimacy. The video showed two exhausted people at 3 in the morning, surrounded by takeout containers and whiteboards covered in chemical formulas. In one clip, I was asleep with my head on a stack of binders while Sterling argued on the phone with a patent lawyer. It was the most unromantic footage in existence, and it was the perfect counter to Mark's grainy telephoto lies. The final piece of my strategy required a visit to the real estate broker who had helped me secure the manor. She was a discreet woman who understood the delicate nature of buying back a foreclosed family estate. I placed the velvet box on her desk, and we reviewed the transfer of ownership agreement I had signed a week before our anniversary. It was legally bulletproof. The document listed me as the sole purchaser, but the gift for husband clause was clearly highlighted. It was the ultimate proof that I hadn't stolen the money. I had spent it on him. But that was the past. I looked at the broker and instructed her to prepare one final document for me to sign on the morning of the settlement, a document that would turn his dream into the exact liquidation value he claimed he wanted. On the morning of the meeting, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my hotel room. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable from the wife who had sat in the obsidian 3 weeks ago. That woman had been hopeful and tired. This woman was sharp, immaculately dressed in a white suit that looked like armor, and completely void of empathy. I had grieved the death of my marriage in silence, and in that darkness, I had killed the part of me that used to make excuses for Mark's insecurity. I picked up my phone and typed out a message to my husband. I did not ask if he was ready. I did not tell him I missed him. I sent him a simple directive that I knew would bait him into the room. I told him to bring all his pride because he was going to need it. I pressed send, watched the delivery status change to read, and walked out the door to end it. The conference room at my law firm was designed to intimidate. It was a glass box suspended 40 floors above the street, offering a panoramic view of the city that made everyone inside look small. I arrived 10 minutes early, taking the seat at the head of the long mahogany table. I had instructed my lead attorney to stay in her office. I only wanted a junior paralegal present to record the minutes. I did not need a lawyer to fight this battle for me. I wanted Mark to see that I was facing him alone, not out of weakness, but because I did not consider him a threat worth the hourly rate of a senior partner. When the door opened, Mark walked in flanked by a short, aggressive-looking man I assumed was his lawyer, and, to my complete lack of surprise, his mother. Constance wore a tweed suit that smelled of mothballs and judgment. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on me with a look of triumph that turned my stomach. She did not say hello. She simply pulled out a chair and remarked loud enough for the room to hear that I looked terrible. She said my pale skin and dark circles were the obvious result of being discarded by a lover who had realized I was past my prime. Mark sat opposite me. He looked polished, radiating the false confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. He did not look at me with anger anymore. He looked at me with pity. He clasped his hands on the table and spoke in a tone that was practiced and patronizing. He told me that he was a reasonable man. He said he was willing to waive his right to spousal support, despite my higher income. On one condition, I had to sign a formal admission of adultery and issue a public apology to him and his family for the embarrassment I had caused. I remained perfectly still. My hands rested lightly on the two objects I had placed on the table in front of me. To my left was a thick black binder containing the forensic evidence of my life over the last 6 months. To my right was the red velvet box, the same one I had carried out of the restaurant 3 weeks ago. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to fill it. Mark's lawyer took the cue and slid a document across the table. He started listing their demands with a greedy enthusiasm. They wanted 50% of our liquid assets, the car, and, most audaciously, half of my performance bonus from the Aetheris project. He claimed that since the work was performed during the marriage, the payout was marital property. Mark nodded along, his eyes gleaming at the mention of the money. It was clear they had already spent it in their minds. I looked from the lawyer to Mark, and finally to Constance, who was smirking as if she had personally won the lottery. A small, cold smile touched my lips. It was not a smile of amusement, and I saw Mark flinch when he saw it. The air in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I asked him quietly if he was absolutely sure he wanted to pursue this path. I told him clearly that there was no turning back after this moment. I gave him one final chance to walk away with his dignity intact. Mark mistook my warning for desperation. Emboldened by his mother's presence and his lawyer's aggressive posture, he slammed his hand down on the table. The sound echoed sharply against the glass walls. He leaned forward, his face twisted with arrogance, and told me to stop stalling. He demanded that I sign the papers and get out of his life so he could finally be free of me. He said he wanted what he was owed. I looked at him for a long second, mourning the man he used to be. Before the feeling vanished completely, he wanted what he was owed. I decided right then that I would give him exactly that. I opened the black binder. The snap of the metal rings echoed in the room like a gunshot. I did not speak. I did not need to. I simply slid the first document across the mahogany table, spinning it so it faced Mark directly. It was a comprehensive timeline of my whereabouts for the last 6 months, cross-referenced and notarized by 3 independent parties: the airline, the hotel management, and the security division of Etheris Biolabs. Every single hour Mark claimed I was with a lover was accounted for. The logs showed me swiping into the laboratory at 2 a.m. They showed me boarding red-eye flights. They proved that while he was home imagining my infidelity, I was drowning in work to secure our future. I watched his eyes scan the pages, his brow furrowing as the first crack appeared in his manufactured reality. Before he could look up, I slid the second document over. It was a sworn affidavit from Dr. Sterling. I had asked Sterling to be brutal, and he had obliged. The document stated in no uncertain terms that not only was our relationship purely professional, but that Sterling had been happily married to his husband, Arthur, for 40 years. Attached to the affidavit was a photograph of the 2 men at their recent anniversary celebration, holding hands on a beach. The image of the elderly, loving couple made Mark's accusations look not just wrong, but grotesque. Mark stared at the photo, his face draining of color as the narrative of the lecherous billionaire evaporated instantly. Constance leaned in, trying to find a flaw in the paperwork, but I was already moving to the next piece of evidence. This one was for her. I pushed a stack of bank statements toward the center of the table. These were not my accounts. They were Mark's. I had highlighted the transactions in neon yellow. While I was working myself to exhaustion, Mark had been systematically draining our joint emergency fund. The statements showed thousands of dollars flowing into online gambling sites and sports betting apps. Constance snatched the paper, her eyes widening as she read the totals. She looked at her son, her mouth opening and closing in shock. She had spent the last month telling everyone I was the one destroying the family finances, only to discover that her perfect son had gambled away the price of a luxury car while sitting on the couch I paid for. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. I delivered the final blow with a printed transcript of Mark's text messages. These were the messages he had sent to his college friends the night he decided to divorce me. I read the highlighted section out loud, my voice steady and cold. In the text, Mark admitted that he had no actual proof of an affair. He wrote that there was no way a woman could make triple his salary without sleeping with the boss. He wrote that he needed to cut me down before I got too big for him to handle. It was an admission of pure, unadulterated misogyny and insecurity. Mark's lawyer stopped taking notes. He looked from the texts to his client with a mixture of disgust and professional resignation. He realized he had been lied to. He closed his file, capped his pen, and leaned back in his chair, signaling physically that he was done fighting for a lost cause. Mark looked around the room, panic setting in. He saw the disappointment in his mother's eyes and the detachment of his lawyer. He realized his moral high ground had turned into a sinkhole. Desperate to regain control, he latched onto the one thing he thought remained unexplained. He pointed a shaking finger at me and shouted about the money. He demanded to know where the $500,000 had gone. He screamed that I had embezzled $500,000 from our accounts and that no amount of paperwork could hide that theft. I stopped moving. The room fell dead silent. This was the moment I had engineered. This was the trap springing shut. I slowly closed the black binder, the sound final and absolute. I looked Mark dead in the eyes, letting him see the pity I felt for him one last time. Then, I reached out and pushed the red velvet box across the table until it rested directly in front of him. You have spent the last 5 years telling anyone who would listen that your life was ruined because your father lost Holloway Manor. Is that not right? My voice was soft, barely rising above a whisper, yet it seemed to echo off the glass walls of the conference room with the weight of a judgment. Mark looked up from the velvet box, his eyes confused, the manufactured anger slowly draining out of him to be replaced by a wary hesitation. I did not wait for him to answer. I continued, listing the specific price of my silence. I told him that the exhaustion he despised was not from a lover's bed. It was from taking on 3 additional consulting projects that I worked on between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning. I told him that I had liquidated my entire personal stock portfolio, every single share I had earned since I was 25. I told him that I had begged Dr. Sterling to vouch for me with the bank, using my professional reputation as collateral to secure a bridge loan that no one else would give us. I intended to surprise you on the night of our anniversary, I said, my voice steady but cutting deep into the silence. I wanted to give you back the one thing you cried about losing. I wanted to restore your honor. Mark. Mark reached out with a trembling hand and lifted the lid of the red velvet box. The hinge creaked in the quiet room. Inside, nestled in the dark satin lining, sat a heavy, antique brass key. It was tarnished and old, the very key his father had surrendered to the bank officers a decade ago. Underneath it lay a thick stack of crisp legal documents. Mark stared at them, his breath catching in his throat as if he had forgotten how to inhale. He pulled the papers out with shaking fingers. The bold title at the top of the first page read, Transfer of Ownership Agreement for Holloway Manor. His eyes darted across the page, scanning the legal jargon until they landed on the critical details. The date of the signature was exactly 1 week before our anniversary dinner. The name of the buyer was Elena Vance, and in the section marked for the statement of purpose, I had instructed the lawyer to type 3 simple words, gift for husband. I watched the color drain from his face until he looked like a ghost. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The late nights, the secrecy, the missing $500,000, the hushed phone calls, none of it was betrayal. It was all for him. Every moment I had spent away from him was a moment spent buying back his dream. The narrative he had constructed of a cheating wife collapsed instantly, crushed under the weight of my overwhelming loyalty. He was not the victim of an affair. He was the recipient of a miracle that he had thrown away. Constance leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she recognized the address on the deed. She gasped, a sound that was equal parts shock and avarice. This was the ancestral home she had mourned for years, the symbol of their family's former glory, sitting right there on the table. Her mouth fell open, and for the first time, the sneer was gone, replaced by a look of tortured regret mixed with a sudden, desperate greed. She looked from the papers to me, realizing too late that the woman she had just called trash was the only person who had ever tried to save them. Mark stared at the deed in his hands, his knuckles turning white as the reality of his catastrophic error set in. The arrogance that had defined him for the last month evaporated, leaving behind a trembling, broken man. Tears began to spill from his eyes, dripping onto the crisp legal paper he was holding. He started to stammer, choking out a disjointed stream of apologies that meant nothing to me. He told me he did not know. He told me he was so sorry. He reached across the mahogany table, his fingers desperate to find mine, trying to bridge the gap he had spent weeks widening with his cruelty. I pulled my hand back sharply, placing it in my lap. I refused to let him touch me. I looked at him with a gaze that was void of any warmth and told him that this gift was supposed to be ours. It was meant to be the foundation of a fresh start, a place where we could have rebuilt the life he felt he had lost. Then, I reached under the stack of evidence and pulled out one final sheet of paper. It was a single page, stamped with an urgent red seal. I slid it toward him. It was a formal notice of revocation of gift and a confirmation of an emergency asset sale. I kept my voice perfectly level as I explained the consequences of his actions. I told him that because he had filed for divorce and publicly accused me of financial misconduct, I was legally advised to liquidate the asset immediately. I could not gift a multi-million-dollar property to a man who was suing me for half of my project bonuses. I had to convert the asset into cash to pay for the exorbitant legal fees his lawsuit would generate and to facilitate the 50-50 division of assets he had demanded just minutes ago. I informed him that I had signed a sale agreement with a commercial resort development group at 8 o'clock that morning, exactly 1 hour before walking into this room. I watched the hope die in his eyes as I delivered the final crushing detail. The developers had no interest in a century-old, drafty mansion. They had bought the land for its location. Holloway Manor was scheduled for demolition the following Monday. The house his grandfather built, the legacy he had wept over for 5 years, would be bulldozed to the ground to make room for a guest parking lot. Mark gasped as if he had been punched in the gut. I told him that he would receive exactly 50% of the sale proceeds. It was a significant amount of money, enough to fix his debts, but the history, the name, and the heritage were gone forever. Mark let out a guttural scream of despair that echoed off the glass walls. He stood up, knocking his chair over, and begged me to stop it. He pleaded with me to call them back, to undo the sale, to save the house. He looked like a drowning man flailing for a rope that had already been cut. I did not move. I simply pointed a manicured finger at the divorce petition lying on the table, the document he had forced me to sign. I told him that he had wanted money. I reminded him that he had accused me of hiding assets because he was terrified of being poor. I told him that now. He had exactly what he asked for. He had the money. Beside him. The color drained completely from Constance's face. The realization that her greed had cost her family the only thing she truly cared about was too much for her to handle. She let out a soft whimper. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways, fainting dead away onto the plush carpet. Mark's lawyer looked at the unconscious woman, then at his hysterical client, and finally at me. He shook his head, closed his briefcase with a snap, and announced that he was withdrawing from the case immediately. He walked out of the room, leaving Mark alone in the wreckage of his own making. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my white suit jacket with deliberate precision. The motion was sharp and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene unraveling on the floor before me. Mark had collapsed to his knees, his posture entirely broken. In his hand, he still gripped the heavy brass key to Holloway Manor, his knuckles white from the intensity of his hold. It was a tragic sight, a man clinging to the physical token of a dream that he had personally destroyed. The key was no longer a tool to open a door. It was just a piece of cold, dead metal, utterly useless in his grasp. I looked down at him, feeling a strange absence of pity. The man I had loved for a decade was gone, replaced by this shell of insecurity and greed. I spoke my final words to him, my voice clear and devoid of any tremor. I told him that trust was the most expensive currency in the world. I told him that he had chosen to trade that trust for his own paranoia and jealousy. I made sure he understood the transaction was final. I told him that the price he paid was everything. He had lost his past legacy, his present stability, and his future happiness, all in a single stroke of arrogance. I picked up the pen from the table. The room was so silent that the only sound was the scratching of the nib against the paper as I signed my name on the divorce decree. I did not hesitate. The signature was bold and unwavering. I capped the pen and placed it gently beside the document, the final punctuation mark on our marriage. I turned toward the door, my heels clicking rhythmically on the polished floor. Behind me, Mark did not move. He did not scramble to stop me. He did not scream. He had entered a state of profound psychological shock. His brain, overloaded by the sudden collision of immense loss and insurmountable guilt, had simply shut down to protect itself. I glanced back one last time. Mark was frozen. His eyes were wide open, staring unblinkingly into the void of the middle distance. He could not speak. He could not lift a finger. He was paralyzed, locked inside his own body by the weight of his realization. It was a catatonic stillness, the physical manifestation of a spirit that had been completely crushed. He looked less like a man and more like a statue carved from misery, surrounded by the scattered debris of legal papers and the ruins of his mother's ambitions. His chest barely moved. He was trapped in the exact moment his life fell apart. There was no forgiveness in my heart, only a vast, cool emptiness. I walked out of the conference room and pressed the button for the elevator. When the doors slid open, I stepped inside. As the machinery hummed to life, I felt a physical sensation of weight lifting from my shoulders. It was the relief of a survivor who had finally reached the shore after treading water for months. I was free. I turned to face the open doors. Mark was still there, framed in the distance, a motionless figure trapped in the prison of his own regret. He did not blink. He did not breathe. As the metal doors began to slide shut, cutting off my view of his soulless face, I knew he would remain there long after I was gone. The doors clicked together, sealing the past away forever. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below to share your thoughts and connect with others. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and give us a hype to help this story reach even more people.